This young woman is called Angela. She's been blind since she was 7 years old, but the voice she carries belongs to someone the whole world forgot. When she was dragged off that community stage for daring to sing, the crowd laughed at her. They had no idea that one man in the parking lot would recognize her voice in a single note, because 20 years ago, that voice belonged to the greatest singer this country ever lost. Angela grew up on the streets of Lagos, singing for coins after losing her sight at age 7. She never knew her mother, only that she had abandoned her as a baby. But everyone in the music industry remembered the name Ebele Okonkwo, a soul singer who died in a car crash in 2003. What nobody knew was that she left behind a daughter, and that daughter was about to be dragged off a community stage in front of everyone who mocked her. The community talent show was supposed to be a celebration of local pride. Families gathered in the modest town hall just outside Lagos, children perched on their parents' shoulders, vendors selling roasted plantains and bottled water to the crowd. The organizers had spent weeks promoting the event, promising a showcase of the region's brightest talents. But when Angela stepped onto that wooden stage, her worn brown dress and dark sunglasses drawing curious stares, the energy in the room shifted. She was not what the audience expected. The other performers had arrived in colorful outfits, their hair styled perfectly, their shoes polished for the occasion. Angela stood barefoot, her short afro uncombed, clutching the microphone with both hands as if it might save her from drowning. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone near the front laughed. A child pointed at her sunglasses, asking his mother why the blind girl thought she could perform like everyone else. What the crowd did not know was that Angela had been preparing for this moment for 15 years. Every morning before dawn, she would walk 3 miles from the orphanage that took her in, positioning herself on the same street corner where the taxi drivers stopped for breakfast. She sang to the sound of engines and the smell of exhaust, learning to read her audience without ever seeing their faces. She knew when people stopped to listen. She knew when they walked faster to avoid her. And she knew, with the instincts of someone who had nothing left to lose, that her voice was the only gift she had ever been given. The organizers had tried to stop her at the registration table. They told her the event was for serious performers only. They asked her to leave, their voices carrying that particular tone of pity that Angela had learned to hate more than cruelty. But she had stood her ground, reciting the registration rules she had memorized from listening to the radio announcement. Nothing in those rules said a blind woman could not compete. So they let her sign her name with shaking hands, the X she marked witnessed by a volunteer who looked away in embarrassment. Now she stood on that stage, the hot lights she could not see bearing down on her skin. The MC announced her name with hesitation, and the scattered applause felt like rain on a tin roof. Then Angela opened her mouth. The first note silenced the room. It was a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her small frame, a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks and 1,000 more hopes. She sang a song her mother had written but never recorded, a melody passed down through the grandmother who had raised Angela for those first 7 years before she too passed away. But before she could reach the second verse, a man in the front row stood up. He was one of the event's sponsors, a local businessman who had contributed money for the prizes. He waved his arms and shouted that this was a waste of time. The crowd, sensing permission to be cruel, began to boo. Someone threw a crumpled water bottle that landed near Angela's feet. She flinched but kept singing, her voice cracking with the effort to be heard over the noise. The organizers rushed the stage. 2 men grabbed Angela by the arms, pulling her toward the exit while she struggled to keep hold of the microphone. The audience laughed as she stumbled, her bare feet catching on the edge of the stage. Someone shouted that she should go back to the streets where she belonged. The MC tried to restore order, but the damage was done. Angela was shoved through the back door into the parking lot, the door slamming behind her with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. She stood alone in the darkness, her sunglasses fogged with tears she refused to let fall. What she did not know was that a black sedan had just pulled into that parking lot, and inside that sedan sat a man who had spent 20 years searching for a voice he thought he would never hear again. Kenneth Obi had not planned to attend the community talent show that evening. He was only in town for a funeral, an old friend from his early days in the music industry who had passed quietly in a hospital bed 3 days before. He had stopped at the venue to ask for directions back to his hotel, his driver having taken a wrong turn somewhere between the church and the city center. The black sedan idled in the parking lot while he checked his phone for a map, the windows rolled down against the humid night air. Then he heard it. One note floating through the thin walls of the town hall. It was a voice he would have recognized anywhere, in any country, in any lifetime. His hand froze on his phone, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was singing a melody he had heard only once before, in a small recording studio in Lagos, 23 years earlier. A melody that had never been released, a song that only 2 people in the world knew existed. Kenneth threw open his car door before the second note could finish. He was halfway across the parking lot when the music stopped. He heard the crowd inside, the booing, the commotion. He heard the back door slam open and watched as two men dragged a young woman out onto the concrete. She stumbled and nearly fell, catching herself against the wall as the door slammed shut behind her. The men walked away without looking back, their laughter carrying across the empty lot. Kenneth stopped. He stood frozen 15 feet away from her, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. She did not see him. She could not see him. She only stood there with her head bowed, her hands trembling at her sides, the tears she refused to shed catching the dim light from a nearby street lamp. He knew those cheekbones. He knew the shape of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders when she was trying not to cry. He had seen that face in photographs, in memories, in dreams that had haunted him for 2 decades. The face belonged to Ebel Okonkwo, the greatest singer Nigeria had ever produced, the woman who had died in a car crash on a highway outside Abuja in 2003. But Ebel was dead. Kenneth had attended her funeral. He had watched them lower her coffin into the ground. He had carried the weight of her loss for 20 years, blaming himself for not being there when she needed him, for not fighting harder to protect her from the industry that had destroyed her. And yet here she stood, or someone who looked exactly like her, alone in a parking lot while a crowd of strangers laughed at the gift she had been given. Angela heard his footsteps before he spoke. She turned her head toward him, her dark sunglasses reflecting the streetlight like mirrors. She had learned to read people by the sound of their breathing, the weight of their steps, the way the air shifted when someone moved closer or farther away. This man was not walking toward her with pity. He was walking toward her with something she could not identify, fear maybe, or hope. Kenneth's voice came out as a whisper. He spoke her name, not Angela's name, but the name of the woman he had lost. He said Ebel, and Angela felt something break open inside her chest, a door she had kept locked for as long as she could remember. She asked him how he knew that name. Her voice was steady despite the tears that had finally begun to fall. She asked him who he was, why he was here, what he wanted from her. But Kenneth could not answer. He could only stare at her, this impossible thing, this ghost-made flesh standing in front of him in a worn brown dress and bare feet. Then he saw her hands. He saw the way she clutched her own elbows, the self-conscious gesture of someone who had been pushed away too many times. He saw the calluses on her fingers from years of playing a guitar she could not afford to replace. He saw the scar on her left wrist from an accident she did not remember, a wound she had gotten as a child in a house she had long since forgotten. This was not Ebel, this was someone else. This was someone younger, someone who carried the same fire but had been shaped by a different life entirely. And in that moment, Kenneth understood the truth that would change everything. This was Ebel's daughter, the daughter everyone believed had died in that same car crash, the daughter who had vanished from every news story, every obituary, every memory of the tragedy that had taken Nigeria's brightest star. Angela did not know who Ebel Okonkwo was. She had grown up in an orphanage 300 miles from the city where her mother had built her legacy. The nuns who raised her had given her a new name, a new story, a past built from fragments and silence. They had told her she was abandoned, left on the steps of the church with nothing but the clothes on her back. They had never mentioned a famous mother, a legendary voice, a family fortune that should have been hers from birth. Kenneth stepped closer. He introduced himself slowly, his voice careful, the voice of a man who understood that the wrong words could shatter something fragile. He told her he was a music producer. He told her he had worked with her mother, and he watched as her expression shifted, the confusion giving way to something deeper, a hunger she had buried so far down she had almost forgotten it existed. Angela asked him to tell her everything. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the softness. She had spent 22 years wondering where she came from, why she was different, why the other children had families who visited on holidays, while she sat alone in the chapel singing to saints who never answered her prayers. Now a stranger stood in front of her claiming to know the answers, and she was ready to listen. But before Kenneth could speak another word, the back door of the town hall burst open again. The same two men who had dragged Angela outside emerged with flashlights and aggressive voices. They told Kenneth to leave, that the event was over, that the blind girl needed to stop loitering on private property. One of them grabbed Angela's arm, his fingers digging into her skin with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been held accountable for his actions. Kenneth stepped between them. He spoke with the authority of a man who had spent decades negotiating with some of the most powerful people in the African music industry. He told the men that Angela was with him. He told them to release her immediately. And when they hesitated, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number that would reach the local police commissioner, a man who owed him a favor from a deal they had made years ago. The men backed away. They muttered something about trouble they did not need and disappeared back inside, leaving Kenneth and Angela alone in the parking lot once more. The silence between them felt heavy with everything that had not yet been said. Angela reached out and found Kenneth's sleeve. gripping the fabric as if afraid he might vanish like every other person who had ever shown her kindness. Kenneth helped her into the back seat of his sedan. He told his driver to head toward the city, toward his hotel, toward a conversation that would take the entire night and change both their lives forever. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, Angela turned her face toward the open window, feeling the night air against her skin. She did not know what lay ahead. She did not know that within 48 hours, her voice would be heard by millions of people who had forgotten her mother's name. She did not know that the man sitting beside her would risk everything to give her the chance that had been stolen from her 20 years ago. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, someone had listened, and he had not looked away. The hotel lobby was nearly empty at that hour, the night staff watching with tired curiosity as a well-dressed man guided a blind young woman in a worn brown dress toward the private elevator. Kenneth had requested a conference room where they could speak without interruption, knowing that the conversation ahead would require every ounce of patience he could summon. Angela walked beside him with her hand on his arm, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. The room he chose overlooked the city lights of Lagos, a view Angela could not see but could feel in the openness of the space. Kenneth helped her into a chair and ordered tea from room service, buying himself time to organize the chaos of thoughts racing through his mind. He had spent 20 years carrying the guilt of Ebel's death, believing there was nothing he could have done to change what happened. Now he sat across from her daughter, a young woman who had been erased from history and left to survive on the margins of a world that should have been hers. He began at the beginning. He told Angela about her mother, about Ebel Okonkwo, the girl from a small village who had arrived in Lagos with nothing but her voice and a dream that refused to die. He described the first time he heard her sing, in a cramped studio above a printing shop, how the producers in the room had fallen silent as her voice filled every corner of the space. He told her about the albums that sold millions of copies, the concerts that drew crowds larger than any Nigerian artist had ever seen, the awards that lined the shelves of a home Angela had never known existed. Angela listened without interruption, her hands wrapped around the teacup that had been placed in front of her, the warmth grounding her as the story unfolded. She learned that her mother had been more than a singer. She had been a force, a woman who had fought for ownership of her own music in an industry that treated female artists as commodities. She had built a fortune, a foundation for artists without resources, a legacy that should have provided for the daughter she left behind. Then Kenneth told her about the crash. The details were sparse but devastating. A rainy night on the highway between Lagos and Abuja. A car that investigators said had lost control on the wet pavement. A driver who survived with minor injuries. And Ebel, thrown from the vehicle before it caught fire, pronounced dead at the scene. The funeral had been a national event. 3 days of mourning had been declared across the country. And somewhere in the chaos, a 2-year-old girl had vanished from every official record. Angela asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the story began. She asked where her mother's money had gone. She asked who had inherited the estate, the royalties, the foundation that bore Ebel's name. And Kenneth's silence told her everything she needed to know before he spoke a single word. The answer led to a name Angela had never heard, Marcus Ademi. He had been Ebel's manager, the man who handled every aspect of her career, the man Kenneth had trusted to protect her interests when the industry tried to exploit her talent. After the crash, Marcus had stepped forward to manage her estate. He had claimed there was no surviving family, that Ebel had been an only child with parents who had died years before. He had produced documents, witnesses, a narrative that convinced the courts and the public alike, and he had taken control of everything. The royalties from 12 million albums sold, the real estate holdings valued at over 40 million American dollars, the foundation funds that had been meant to support struggling artists. All of it had flowed into accounts controlled by one man. Kenneth had suspected something was wrong almost immediately after the funeral, but every investigation he launched ran into walls. Documents he requested were lost. Witnesses changed their stories. Legal challenges were dismissed on technicalities, and the industry that had once celebrated Ebel's memory moved on to new stars, new scandals, new profits. Marcus Ademi had become one of the most powerful figures in African entertainment, his influence extending into politics, media, and the kind of wealth that could silence almost anyone who asked too many questions. Now Kenneth understood why he had never found the truth. Angela had not been killed in that crash. She had been hidden, erased, placed in an orphanage far from anyone who might recognize her face. Someone had made sure she would never be found. Someone had created a paper trail that led nowhere, a death certificate for a child who was still breathing, a story designed to protect a fortune built on stolen legacy. Angela sat in silence for a long moment after Kenneth finished speaking. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an edge that surprised him. She asked why he had never searched for the child. She asked how he could have let this happen, how he could have attended that funeral and walked away without demanding answers. And Kenneth had no defense. He had failed her mother in life, and he had failed her daughter in death. The weight of that failure pressed against his chest like a stone he had been carrying for 2 decades without knowing it existed. But Angela did not want his guilt. She wanted something else entirely. She wanted to know what Kenneth planned to do about it. She asked him if he had the resources to fight Marcus Adami, to challenge the empire he had built on her mother's bones. She asked him if he was willing to risk everything to help her take back what had been stolen. And for the first time that night, Kenneth saw the fire in her that reminded him so painfully of Ebel. He told Angela about the televised tribute concert scheduled to take place in 3 days. It was the 20th anniversary of Ebel's death, and Marcus Adami had organized a massive event in her memory. The biggest names in African music would perform her songs. Millions of viewers would tune in across the continent. And Marcus himself would take the stage at the end to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award in Ebel's name, celebrating the legacy he had stolen from the daughter standing in front of him. Kenneth had been invited to attend as a guest. He had planned to decline, unwilling to participate in what he had always believed was a hollow performance of grief. But now he saw an opportunity. The concert would be broadcast live, the cameras would be rolling, and if Angela appeared on that stage, if she sang her mother's music with the voice Kenneth had heard in that parking lot, there would be no way for Marcus to silence her. The whole world would see Ebel's face in her features. The whole world would hear Ebel's voice in her song, and the lie that had protected a fortune for 20 years would crumble in front of millions of witnesses. Angela listened to the plan with her head tilted, processing every angle, every risk, every possible way this could go wrong. She had never performed on a stage larger than a street corner. She had never faced a crowd that was not mocking her, rejecting her, pushing her toward the exit. But she had also never had anything worth fighting for. Now she had a mother's memory. She had a legacy that belonged to her. And she had a chance to stand in front of the man who had stolen everything and take it back with the only weapon she had ever possessed. She told Kenneth she would do it. Her voice was steady, calm, the voice of someone who had survived too much to be afraid of what came next. And Kenneth felt something shift in the room, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for 20 years. He reached across the table and took Angela's hand, promising her that he would not fail her again. He would get her onto that stage. He would make sure the cameras were rolling, and he would stand beside her when the world finally learned the truth. But Marcus Adami was not a man who left things to chance, and neither Kenneth nor Angela knew that in a luxurious office on the other side of Lagos, a phone was already ringing with news that a blind street singer had been seen leaving a hotel with one of the most respected producers in the industry. The wheels were already turning, the protections were already activating, and the war for Ebel's legacy was about to begin in earnest. The next 48 hours moved like water through a cracked dam. Kenneth worked his contacts with the desperation of a man who had been given a second chance he did not deserve. He called in favors from every producer, every studio engineer, every journalist who had ever owed him a professional debt. He arranged for Angela to meet with vocal coaches who could help her prepare for the largest audience she would ever face. He secured a place for her among the backup performers at the tribute concert, a small role that would give her access to the stage without raising suspicion. And he prayed to whatever forces might be listening that Marcus Adami would not discover their plan until it was too late to stop it. Angela spent those 2 days in a state of controlled terror. She had never worn stage makeup, never performed with professional sound equipment, never stood in front of cameras that would broadcast her face to millions of strangers. The vocal coach Kenneth hired was a patient woman named Yemi who had worked with some of the biggest stars in Nigeria. She recognized something in Angela's voice immediately, a quality she described as ancestral memory, as if the music had been passed down through blood and bone without anyone needing to teach it. By the end of their second session, Yemi told Kenneth that Angela was ready. Whether the world was ready remained to be seen. Marcus Adami moved through those same 48 hours with the calm confidence of a man who had survived every threat to his empire for 20 years. His informants had told him about the blind girl, about Kenneth's involvement, about the meetings in hotel conference rooms and recording studios. He did not yet understand what they were planning, but he understood that something was coming. He ordered his security team to increase their presence at the tribute concert. He made phone calls to executives at the television networks that would carry the broadcast, and he waited, patient as a snake coiled in the grass, for whatever challenge Kenneth Obi thought he could mount against an institution that had been built on silence and buried secrets. The night of the concert arrived with a red carpet stretched across the entrance of the National Arts Theater in Lagos. Limousines deposited celebrities in designer gowns and tailored suits, their smiles flashing for cameras that captured every moment for the millions watching at home. The tribute to Ebele Okonkwo had been promoted for months, a celebration of her life and legacy organized by the man who claimed to be the guardian of her memory. Posters bearing her image lined the walls of the venue. Her songs played over the speakers as guests found their seats, and in a dressing room tucked behind the main stage, Angela stood in front of a mirror she could not see, wearing a dress that had been purchased for her that afternoon, preparing to face the largest audience of her life. Kenneth had told her the plan 3 times, making sure she understood every step. She would wait in the wings while the scheduled performers finished their sets. When the final commercial break ended, she would walk onto the stage and begin to sing. The song she had chosen was the same one her mother had been performing the night Kenneth first heard her voice, an unreleased track called Return to Me that Ebele had written for the daughter she was never able to raise. Angela had learned the lyrics from a recording Kenneth had kept hidden for 20 years, a demo that had survived in his private collection when every other copy had been destroyed. The concert began with a video montage of Ebele's greatest performances. Angela listened from backstage as her mother's voice filled the theater, the sound so familiar and yet so strange, a ghost she had never known reaching across time to touch her. The audience responded with applause that shook the walls, a wave of love for an artist who had been gone for 2 decades. And Marcus Adami sat in the front row, accepting condolences and congratulations from the powerful people who had gathered to honor the woman he had betrayed. The performances that followed were respectful, professional, the kind of tribute that television audiences expected from events like this. Famous singers covered Ebele's hits, their voices strong but lacking the particular fire that had made her recordings unforgettable. The crowd clapped politely, tweeted their appreciation, settled into the rhythm of a well-produced but predictable evening. And then the final commercial break ended, and Angela walked onto the stage. The audience did not know what to make of her at first. She was not introduced by name. She simply appeared, her dark sunglasses catching the spotlight, her bare feet visible beneath the hem of her dress. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, the same whispers that had followed her at the community talent show. But this time, Kenneth had arranged for the cameras to stay focused on her face. This time, there would be no cutting away, no editing room to erase what happened next. Angela sang the first note of Return to Me, and the theater fell silent. Her voice was clearer than it had been in the parking lot, stronger than it had been in the hotel room, as if everything she had learned about herself in the past 3 days had given her permission to become who she was always meant to be. The cameras captured every moment. The broadcast carried her voice into living rooms across Africa, Europe, and America. And in the front row, Marcus Adami's face went pale as he stared at features he had tried to erase from history. She sang the second verse, and the audience began to understand what they were witnessing. They saw Ebele's cheekbones, her jaw, the way she moved her hands when she reached for the highest notes. They heard echoes of a voice they had loved and mourned, reborn in a young woman who carried the same fire in her blood. Social media began to explode with questions, with recognition, with the kind of organic viral response that no marketing budget could purchase. And Angela kept singing, her voice building toward a crescendo that would shake the foundations of the empire built on her mother's bones. When she finished, the silence lasted for 3 full heartbeats. Then the applause began, starting in the back of the theater and rolling forward like a wave, building until it became a roar that shook the lights above the stage. Angela stood in the center of that storm, tears streaming beneath her sunglasses, and waited for Kenneth to walk out from the wings and stand beside her. He took her hand and turned to face the cameras, knowing that every word he spoke next would be broadcast to millions of viewers who had just witnessed something they could never forget. He told them who Angela was. He told them about the car crash that had killed Ebele Okonkwo, about the daughter who had supposedly died alongside her, about the investigation he had attempted for 20 years. He spoke clearly, delivering every accusation not as speculation but as documented fact. And he named Marcus Adami as the man who had hidden the truth, who had stolen a fortune from an orphan, who had built his empire on a foundation of lies. The cameras found Marcus in the front row. His expression had shifted from pale shock to something harder, a calculation that would have worked in boardrooms and private meetings, but crumbled under the gaze of millions of witnesses. He stood and walked toward the stage, his security detail following, but the crowd had already turned against him. People stood from their seats, forming a barrier between Marcus and the woman whose life he had tried to erase. The security team looked at each other, uncertain whether to protect their employer or distance themselves from a man who had just been exposed in front of the world. The police arrived 17 minutes later. Kenneth had arranged for officers from the anti-corruption unit to be stationed nearby, armed with evidence he had spent the past 2 days compiling. They arrested Marcus on live television, leading him away in handcuffs while the cameras rolled and the audience watched. His protests went unheeded. The documents he had falsified, the witnesses he had paid, the entire apparatus of silence he had constructed over 20 years began to unravel in real time. Angela stood on that stage through all of it, her hand still holding Kenneth's, her mother's song still echoing in the air around her. She did not yet know that within weeks she would be confirmed as the legal heir to an estate worth over $40 million. She did not know that she would inherit the foundation her mother had created, or that she would use its resources to support blind artists across the continent. She did not know that the recording she had just performed would be released as a single and reach #1 in 12 countries within a month. She only knew that, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But there was one more revelation waiting for her, a truth Kenneth had discovered in his research and kept hidden until the right moment. The driver who had survived the crash that killed Ebel had given a statement before his death 3 years earlier, a statement that had been buried in police archives. In that statement, he had admitted that the car had been sabotaged, the brakes had been cut, the crash had been planned. And the man who had ordered the assassination was sitting in the front row of every major event honoring Ebel's memory, collecting the profits from her death for 20 years. Marcus Adami would face trial for fraud, for embezzlement, for the theft of a child's inheritance. But he would also face trial for murder, and Angela would be there to watch justice delivered for the mother she had never known and the life she had been denied. 6 months after that night, Angela stood on a different stage in a different city. She had recorded her first album, a collection of songs her mother had written but never released, and it had debuted at #1 across 3 continents. The foundation that Ebel had created was finally fulfilling its original purpose, supporting young artists who had nothing but their talent and their will to survive. And Angela had become something more than a singer or an heiress. She had become a symbol of every voice that had been silenced, every story that had been buried, every truth that had waited decades to be heard. Kenneth remained by her side, not as a manager or a mentor, but as family. He had carried his guilt for 20 years, and now he channeled that weight into something that honored Ebel's memory. He had helped Angela find her grandmother, the woman who had raised her for those first 7 years before illness took her ability to care for a child. That grandmother had died 5 years before Angela found her way back, but the house she left behind was filled with photographs, letters, and recordings that painted a picture of the mother Angela had lost. For the first time, she could see Ebel's face, not through someone else's description, but through images she could touch with her fingers. Marcus Adami was convicted on 17 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and first-degree murder. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, his empire dismantled, his name stripped of every honor he had purchased with stolen money. The trial revealed the full scope of his crimes, the bribes he had paid, the witnesses he had silenced, the network of corruption that had protected him for 2 decades. And Angela sat in the courtroom for every day of testimony, her dark sunglasses hiding tears that fell for the mother she never knew and the justice that had finally arrived. But the question that lingers is not about Marcus or his crimes. It is about how many other Angelas exist in the world, how many voices have been silenced by people with the power to erase them, how many stories are waiting for someone to listen. Angela found her way back because one man heard a single note in a parking lot and refused to walk away. That was the miracle, but miracles should not be required for justice to prevail. Angela still sings. She still closes her eyes when the music takes her, still loses herself in the melodies that flow through her blood, and somewhere she believes her mother can hear her. Finally, after 20 years of silence, Ebel Okonkwo's voice lives on in the daughter who was never supposed to survive. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless stories like Angela's waiting to be told, and we bring them to you every week. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.